June 4, 1944, Portsmouth Harbor, England. The wind whipped across the gray Channel waters carrying the scent of diesel and salt. 1,000 ships creaked in their moorings, their decks stacked with tanks, trucks, and armored carriers, all waiting for the signal that would unleash the greatest invasion in human history. The docks were chaos, organized chaos, but chaos nonetheless. Mechanics shouted over the clang of steel, officers barked orders through megaphones, and engineers crawled beneath vehicles with grease-stained hands, checking for leaks, tightening bolts, praying everything would survive what came next. Because the sea, they knew, could kill just as easily as the enemy. Near the edge of the pier, under the shadow of a Sherman tank suspended by a crane, a short, wiry man in oil-streaked overalls adjusted his goggles and squinted at the waterline of a landing craft. His name was Christopher Cockerell, a quiet British engineer, one who had never seen battle but whose hands were about to shape its outcome. No one shouted his name, no medals awaited him, but what he discovered in these final hours before D-Day would save thousands of lives and ensure the invasion did not die on the beaches. Cockerell wiped his brow and watched as a tank rumbled forward, its treads clanking like iron thunder. It was a Sherman DD, a special duplex-drive amphibious tank meant to float on a collapsible canvas skirt. In theory, it could sail across the surf under its own power. In practice, many of them sank before reaching shore. He'd seen the tests himself. He'd watched proud tank crews vanish beneath cold water in minutes. "The sea doesn't forgive optimism," he'd muttered then, his voice barely audible over the waves. The problem wasn't courage or planning, it was simple physics. Engines drowned, exhaust pipes flooded, tanks designed for land simply couldn't breathe underwater long enough to reach the fight. Yet the Allied plan demanded it. Thousands of vehicles would storm the beaches directly from landing craft, rolling through churning waves and soft sand under enemy fire. If even a quarter of them failed to make it ashore, the entire invasion could collapse before it began. That thought haunted Cockerell. He wasn't a general, he wasn't even a soldier. He was a mechanic, one of thousands, but unlike most, he refused to accept that a machine's limits were final. The air reeked of oil and seawater as he knelt beside a half-submerged truck being tested for waterproofing. Rubber seals ringed the doors and hatches, but the problem wasn't the seals, it was the exhaust. As soon as the vehicle hit a wave higher than its muffler, the back pressure forced water straight into the cylinders. Engines stalled, died, and never restarted. He scribbled a note in the margin of his grease-stained logbook. Exhaust plus intake equals death, need separation, need height, need breath. The solution came to him not as a flash of genius, but as a mechanic's instinct. If the engines drowned when water met the exhaust, then raise the exhaust above the waterline. He rummaged through a pile of scrap tubing, scavenging bits of pipe, old filters, and clamps. Within an hour, he'd built a crude snorkel system, a flexible tube attached to the engine's exhaust and air intake, rising above the tank's deck like a pair of periscopes. He sealed the joints with tar and rubber, tested the pressure, then motioned to a corporal nearby. "Let's see if she breathes," he said. The corporal laughed. "If she doesn't, neither will we." They eased the vehicle down the ramp. The water foamed and hissed as the waves slapped against the hull. For a moment the engine sputtered, then it roared. Smoke poured from the elevated pipes high and dry above the surf. The tank rolled forward slowly but alive into the water and then miraculously out again on the far side. Cockerell said nothing, he simply nodded once and exhaled. By nightfall, the news spread through the docks like wildfire. Officers from the Royal Engineers arrived with notebooks, measuring the pipes, inspecting the seals, replicating the design. The modification was crude, but it worked, and it could be fitted to almost any vehicle from jeeps to heavy transports. Soon, teams of mechanics worked by lantern light, attaching snorkels, greasing joints, and sealing air filters. One man's idea had become a silent order across the harbor. Every vehicle must breathe, every engine must live. 2 days later, the winds howled stronger, delaying the invasion. Yet those extra hours gave the crews time to install more of Cockerell's makeshift systems. Men grumbled, commanders paced, but the work continued. Then came June 6, 1944. As the armada departed under the gray dawn, Cockerell stood alone on the pier, watching. Landing craft after landing craft surged toward the horizon, loaded with tanks, trucks, and men, each one bearing a small piece of his handiwork. He didn't know then how many lives his idea would save. He only knew this: when those ramps dropped, when steel met surf and chaos reigned, those engines would roar instead of drown. And that meant the invasion would live. June 6, 1944, 05:20 hours off the coast of Normandy. The channel was alive with noise. The rhythmic growl of engines, the slap of waves against steel hulls, and the distant thunder of naval guns rolling like an angry storm. Dawn broke gray and pale, revealing an ocean covered with ships, thousands of them stretching to the horizon. From battleships to landing craft, from minesweepers to medical barges, it was a floating city of war. Inside one of the smaller landing craft, an LCVP Higgins boat packed with soldiers and a single Sherman tank, its turret wrapped in a tarpaulin, the air was thick with diesel fumes and fear. The men were soaked from the spray. Their helmets rattled with every slam of the hull against the waves. A corporal glanced toward the tank's rear deck where the new exhaust pipes jutted up like twin chimneys. They hissed, sputtering black smoke. He didn't know who had thought of it, he didn't care, but he hoped to God it worked. 30 seconds, the coxswain shouted. The boat veered sharply, heading straight for the beach codenamed Sword. Machine gun fire rattled in the distance, faint but growing louder. On the horizon, the beaches of Normandy were a blur of chaos. Smoke and sand mixed in a gray haze. Flashes of light tore through the morning mist, artillery, tracer fire, the bursting shells of German 88s pounding the surf. One landing craft hit a mine, the explosion threw water and steel into the air. Another craft turned sideways, waves flooding its ramp. Tanks slipped, engines screamed and sank. But not all of them. A line of vehicles, Shermans, half-tracks, and trucks roared forward from the shallows, coughing water from their snorkel pipes, emerging like beasts rising from the deep. Their treads dug into the sand. Steel grinding over obstacles that should have stopped them cold. One of the officers watching from a command boat shouted over the radio. "They're rolling, the tanks are rolling straight through." To most, it was just relief the plan was working. But to a few in the engineering corps it was something more profound. The waterproofing held, the exhaust stayed dry, the engines lived. Cockerell's idea, a piece of scrap tubing and a desperate night of improvisation, had turned into the difference between triumph and disaster. On Omaha Beach the story was grimmer. Many of the specialized floating tanks launched too far offshore. The waves were cruel, higher, colder, unrelenting. Crews watched in horror as DD tanks sank one after another, swallowed by the sea. But the waterproofed Shermans that made it closer to shore, the ones with the extended pipes and sealed intakes, fared better. They rolled straight off their landing craft and into the inferno, their treads churning through surf and sand as water splashed harmlessly around their engines. A lieutenant from the 741st Tank Battalion later wrote, "I don't know who came up with those ridiculous pipes, but I'd buy him a drink. Our tanks should have been dead in the water, instead they were firing before our boots hit the beach." By mid-morning, Allied vehicles were pushing inland. The beaches that could have become watery graves were now staging grounds for the liberation of Europe. Every tank that rolled forward was more than just a weapon, it was a machine that had defied nature. And behind that miracle wasn't a general or a strategist. It was a man in overalls, working by lantern light in a cold English dockyard. Back in Portsmouth, as radio chatter filled the air, Cockerell listened quietly. Reports flooded in, landings successful, armor advancing, supply trucks ashore. No one mentioned him by name, no one ever would. But among the clatter of teletypes and the cheers of exhausted mechanics, he heard what mattered most: that distant, steady rumble of engines surviving the sea. He closed his logbook, the last entry written in hurried pencil. "Engines breathing, mission complete." Outside, the harbor was empty now, the armada gone. Only the gulls remained, circling above the calm gray water that had almost swallowed the invasion whole. Cockerell stood at the edge of the pier, his reflection rippling in the tide, and for a long moment he said nothing. The war would move on, from Normandy to Paris, from France to Berlin, and history would remember the generals, the politicians, and the battles. But he knew. He'd been there when the machines found their breath. June 7, 1944, Portsmouth, England. The harbor that had once thundered with engines now stood eerily quiet. Only the echo of distant waves filled the air and the smell of diesel hung like a ghost. Crates sat empty, ropes drifted in the tide, and tools lay scattered where mechanics had dropped them in exhaustion before the invasion began. In a small corner of a supply shed, Christopher Cockerell leaned against a workbench, hands black with grease and eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. A battered radio on the table crackled with static and news of the invasion. Voices spoke of tanks rolling inland, convoys securing beachheads, the Allies gaining ground. But not a single word mentioned him, not the mechanic who had made those tanks breathe. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his logbook, and flipped to the last page, a crumpled sketch of a pipe system drawn in the margins beside measurements scribbled in fading pencil. It looked like nothing, just lines, arrows, and grease stains, but those lines had saved an army. He smiled faintly, then closed the book. Elsewhere, the world was already rewriting history. In London, officers drafted reports filled with statistics: tonnage landed, vehicles delivered, losses sustained. Commanders sent coded messages of congratulations to Eisenhower's staff. Newspapers printed headlines in massive type. Allies storm Europe. The invasion begins. Victory on the beaches. No one printed a line about the mechanic who stayed behind in the shadows, who turned scrap metal and desperation into a weapon. That was the nature of war. It remembered the thunder, not the hands that built it. Cockerell's life didn't stop at D-Day. After the war, he moved on quietly as always. He tinkered, he invented, he drew designs for machines no one else could imagine. His notebooks filled with strange shapes, funnels, jets, curved chambers. People called them impractical, even absurd. But to him, they were ideas that breathed just like those tanks once had. One design in particular obsessed him, a craft that could ride not on water but above it. He imagined a cushion of air lifting a vehicle clear of waves, friction, and drag. He called it an air cushion vehicle. The world would later call it the hovercraft. Few connected the dots, but that same mechanic who kept D-Day's engines alive was the mind who gave the world a new way to conquer both land and sea. Decades later, when interviewers asked about his wartime work, Cockerell rarely spoke of it. "It wasn't glamorous," he once said, "just engineering, just trying to make sure men didn't drown." But those who understood, the naval engineers, the veterans who had driven those waterproofed tanks onto the beaches under fire, they remembered. A sergeant who landed on Gold Beach once wrote in his memoirs, "Our tank made it off the boat and through 6 feet of water. We should have sunk. I don't know who fixed that, but I owe him my life." That unnamed who was Cockerell. History, as it often does, moved on without fanfare. When the celebrations ended, when the parades faded, when the films glorified the generals and the battleships, the stories of men like him were lost in the noise. Yet every tank that rolled through the surf, every truck that reached the dunes, every engine that coughed through salt and fear and still kept running, they were his legacy. It wasn't medals or titles that defined him. It was the sound, that deep, defiant rumble of engines surviving the sea. July 1945. The war in Europe was over, the Allies had won. On the quiet shores of Normandy, the tides washed over the rusting hulks of landing craft and the bones of machines left behind. And beneath that same surf, invisible to history, lay the memory of a mechanic's miracle. His name wasn't etched in marble nor carved into the pages of military glory. But in every ripple that touched those beaches there was a whisper of his work, a soft, steady hum that said, "We survived because we could breathe." And somewhere in a small English workshop, Christopher Cockerell lifted another blueprint, another wild idea no one yet understood. He smiled, that same quiet smile, the one he wore watching the invasion ships vanish into the fog. Because he knew what few others did, that even the greatest victories in history often began with the hum of a single engine. In the hands of one forgotten mechanic. Epilogue, the sound that history forgot. 1982, Lowestoft, England. The sea was calm that morning, gray and glittering under a sky that looked almost metallic. A lone man in his 70s stood near the edge of a dock, coat buttoned against the cold, his thinning hair ruffled by the wind. Behind him, a small hovercraft skimmed effortlessly across the harbor's surface, gliding on a cushion of air just as he'd once imagined decades earlier. Sir Christopher Cockerell watched it pass with quiet satisfaction. The machine hummed not with the roar of an engine drowning in seawater but with a low, confident thrum, the sound of a craft untethered by waves, free to move where ships once faltered. To most onlookers, it was a technological marvel, a British invention exported across the world. To Cockerell, it was simply a continuation of the same story, machines learning to breathe. He chuckled softly to himself. Still afloat, he murmured. For 40 years, no one had truly known what he'd done before D-Day, not the generals, not the press, not even most of the men who'd survived because of him, but the old engineer never demanded recognition. His reward, he often said, was the sound of engines that refused to die. He still remembered that night in Portsmouth, the smell of diesel, the sting of salt, the endless clang of metal as men worked under lamps to fit those makeshift snorkels. He remembered the faces, young mechanics, soldiers, dockworkers, all desperate to make something that could survive what waited across the channel. And he remembered the silence after the invasion when the harbor emptied and he was left alone with nothing but the echoes of what he'd helped set in motion. Years later, historians digging through wartime engineering records stumbled across his name. They found diagrams, notes, and test reports labeled Vehicle Waterproofing and Exhaust Modification Project, C. Cockerell, 1944. The documents described exactly what he had built: flexible exhaust extensions, rubber-sealed intakes, and ventilation systems that allowed armored vehicles to wade through surf without flooding. It was crude by modern standards, but it worked flawlessly. An engineer who reviewed the papers decades later summed it up perfectly. Without those waterproofing systems, a third of the invasion's vehicles would have drowned before they reached the beach. The scale of D-Day made them seem small, but those small fixes saved the whole operation. By the time his contributions became known, Cockerell had already been knighted for inventing the hovercraft. His wartime innovations, though, were still little more than a footnote, overshadowed by the grander names of D-Day. But perhaps that was how he preferred it. He'd never sought fame, only function. One of his apprentices, years after his death, recalled something Cockerell said while repairing an old engine. "Perfection isn't loud, it's the machine that works so well you forget it could have failed." Today, if you visit the landing beaches of Normandy, you can still find remnants of waterproofed tanks, rusted pipes, fragments of rubber seals, the skeletons of machines that once crawled out of the sea. And if you stand there long enough, listening to the surf, you might hear it, the faint rumble of an engine beneath the waves, echoing through time. It isn't the sound of war. It's the sound of survival. The sound that one forgotten mechanic gave to an army on the day the world changed. Afterward, the legacy beneath the waves. The tide at Normandy still moves with the same rhythm it did on June 6, 1944, slow, deliberate, endless. It washes over the relics of war, smoothing jagged steel and scattering the remnants of invasion across the sand. Tourists walk where soldiers once crawled, where engines once screamed, and where death met ingenuity head-on. Few who visit realize that the quiet hum of history beneath their feet belongs, in part, to a man they've never heard of, a mechanic whose fingerprints linger in every machine that learned to fight the sea. In modern military engineering, waterproofing and air intake systems are now routine. Every amphibious vehicle, every marine landing craft carries echoes of those first improvised snorkels built under lantern light in Portsmouth. Engineers call it submersion tolerance, air displacement control, sealed exhaust architecture. But the principle remains the same: make the machine breathe before the man has to. The world moves on, layering new technology over old, and the original stories fade into the noise of progress. Yet within every innovation lies the ghost of its origin, the trial, the failure, the one desperate night when a mechanic refused to accept that drowning was inevitable. In a small museum in Lowestoft, there's a dusty exhibit tucked between models of hovercraft and wartime photographs. It holds a single rusted exhaust pipe cut from a Sherman tank that landed on Gold Beach. A faded card beside it reads, Prototype waterproof exhaust, designed and fitted by C. Cockerell and Royal Engineers, 1944. It's easy to walk past without a second glance. It isn't glamorous, it isn't famous, but it represents one of the smallest, most vital pieces of the D-Day machine, the breath of an army preserved in steel. For every invention that wins a war, there are hundreds that go unnoticed. A bolt turned, a seal tightened, a pipe bent into the right curve at the right time. These are the miracles history forgets, the ones that make legends possible. Cockerell's life reminds us that progress rarely begins with glory. It begins in silence, in a workshop, in the hands of someone who sees failure not as defeat but as a puzzle waiting to be solved. And on that morning in June 1944, while generals wrote history from war rooms and soldiers carved it in blood, Christopher Cockerell shaped it with nothing more than determination, tubing, and tar. As the waves continue their endless motion across Normandy's shores, they still carry fragments of that day, salt, sand, and the faint whisper of exhaust bubbles bursting above the waterline. It's the same sound Cockerell heard all those years ago when he tested his first design, the sound that told him his machine could breathe. A sound that meant the invasion would live. A sound that even now refuses to die. Final reflection, the quiet engine of history. The Normandy beaches have changed since that day. The bunkers crumble, the barbed wire has rusted away, and the wind no longer smells of cordite or diesel. Children play where soldiers once bled. The sea, eternal and indifferent, continues its rhythm, advancing, retreating, erasing footprints, yet never the memory. And in that gentle persistence lies the truth of Christopher Cockerell's legacy. His invention was never meant to conquer or to destroy, it was meant to endure, to let men and machines do what they were meant to do, to survive long enough to matter. Historians often look for defining moments, the raising of a flag, the signing of a treaty, the flash of victory frozen in a photograph. But history's real heartbeat is quieter than that. It lives in the unseen, in the mechanic's wrench turning in the dark, in the engineer's sketch on a scrap of paper, in the small, stubborn refusal to let something fail. Cockerell's work didn't roar like a bomber engine or blaze like artillery, it whispered. Yet that whisper reached from the docks of Portsmouth to the beaches of Normandy, from the breath of a single tank engine to the liberation of an entire continent. After the war, Cockerell rarely spoke of D-Day. When asked, he'd shrug, smile faintly, and say, "It was just common sense." But those who worked with him knew there was more to it, an obsession with precision, with solving the unsolvable, with finding grace in the grind of machinery. He believed that technology, at its best, wasn't about power, it was about possibility. And that belief carried him from wartime innovation to peacetime invention, from makeshift exhaust pipes to hovercraft gliding over oceans. He proved that sometimes, the mind that saves a tank on the beach can later teach the world to fly above the waves. Today, his name rests quietly among the greats of British engineering, but his spirit lingers wherever humanity dares to overcome its own limits. Every time an amphibious vehicle crawls from surf to sand, every time a hovercraft lifts from water to air, it carries a whisper from that long, sleepless night in 1944, when one man decided that breathing was not optional. In the end, the story of Christopher Cockerell isn't just about machines or war. It's about endurance, the will to keep creating, keep repairing, keep believing that even in the darkest hours there's always a way to make something live again. The war may have ended long ago, but his lesson remains as steady as the tide. Genius doesn't always shout, sometimes it hums. And if you stand on the shore at Normandy at dawn, listening past the wind, you might still hear it, that faint, defiant hum of an engine that refused to drown. And a mechanic who refused to be forgotten.